Should we terraform lifeless planets? You might think it's easy to dismiss this question as science fiction, but researchers are getting closer and closer to the technology that would make it possible. So let's talk about why we want to do this and whether we should. We tend to use the term terraforming to describe making a planet more like Earth, although strictly speaking, the word just means modifying a planet so that it's suitable for life as we know it. If we discover a lifeless planet that is a little too cold or has an atmosphere that is a little too thin, we could make some relatively small changes to make it habitable. This is called geoengineering. It's a bit broader than terraforming because it doesn't necessarily mean making a planet like Earth. One way we might do this is by changing its atmosphere, either by adding gases to thicken it or removing gases to make it thinner. Increasing the pressure on a planet's surface could also warm it up by a process called the greenhouse effect. Just like here on Earth, more atmosphere means more heat gets trapped and the planet gets warmer. And if we wanted to cool a planet down, we could reduce the amount of water vapor in its atmosphere. Since water vapor is a powerful greenhouse gas, NASA has considered many ways of modifying the atmospheres of planets and moons within our own solar system. Some of these suggestions have been proposed to improve conditions on Mars, which already has a thin atmosphere that's mostly carbon dioxide. Scientists have suggested introducing methane into the atmosphere to warm it up. Methane absorbs and redistributes energy around the planet, warming it up and making the climate more hospitable. But methane also radiates heat out into space. So we'd need to add another greenhouse gas at the same time, such as oxygen, to keep the planet warm enough to support liquid water on the surface. Other wild proposals involve using giant mirrors to warm planets from a distance. For example, one proposal suggests putting mirrors on Mercury, which is close to Mars, and aiming them at Mars to warm it up. Mars is very cold now because it's far away from the sun, but a few billion years ago, it may have had a much thicker atmosphere and been warm enough to have liquid water on the surface. Scientists aren't sure why the atmosphere got so thin, but they think the most likely cause was a runaway greenhouse effect. When the sun was young and more active, it gave off more ultraviolet radiation than it does now. Ultraviolet radiation breaks apart carbon dioxide molecules and the resulting oxygen atoms float away into space. If that happened on Mars, it could have lost its insulating atmosphere over billions of years. Even if we don't think Mars ever had the right conditions to support life, restoring its atmosphere would be an interesting experiment. It would tell us what happened to Earth's ancient atmosphere and help us understand how planetary atmospheres evolve over time. But the most similar planet to Earth in our solar system is probably Venus. Venus has an atmosphere that is mostly carbon dioxide and a thick layer of clouds made mostly of sulfuric acid. The atmospheric pressure at the surface is about 90 times greater than Earth's, and the average surface temperature is about 375 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to melt lead. But if we could somehow get rid of those clouds, Venus would be much nicer. Venus could be terraformed by seeding its clouds with bacteria that produce sulfuric acid aerosol. These bacteria exist here on Earth, where they thrive in environments with high concentrations of sulfuric acid. On Venus, they would reproduce and spread throughout the atmosphere, forming a protective ozone layer that filters out the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Over millions of years, that would allow the planet's temperature to drop enough for water to exist as a liquid. In fact, Venus may have started out very similar to Earth, but its evolution took a different path when it experienced a runaway greenhouse effect that made it too hot and dry to support life. Reverting this process would bring Venus back to a state that's more like Earth. But even without scientists are interested in visiting Venus because its atmosphere is so dense. Spacecraft have to land deep inside the planet's crushing atmosphere, which makes landings difficult. But if we could land on Venus, we'd find that the lower atmosphere is much less hostile. At an altitude of about 30 miles, the temperature and pressure are similar to those at the bottom of the ocean. And at an altitude of about 50 miles, the pressure is the same as at the top of Mount Everest. So should we go ahead and terraform or geoengineer these planets? Before we decide, there are several questions we need to ask. Is it technically possible? Who will do the and who owns the planet afterwards? And what's the right thing to do from a philosophical standpoint? Let's start with technical feasibility. Well, the good news is that we already know how to terraform to some extent. Humans have been doing it for centuries. By cutting down forests and burning fossil fuels, we've changed the composition of Earth's atmosphere and increased the average global temperature by a few degrees. But unfortunately, we've caused major problems for ourselves and other species along the way. So if we're going to attempt terraforming on any other planet, we'll need to do it carefully. What about legal and ownership issues? Well, as far as we know, no country currently has a claim on any planets or moons beyond Earth. The closest thing we have is the claim that all countries agree that the moon is unowned by anyone. In 1967, they signed a treaty that banned countries from claiming territory on the moon or from placing weapons there. But there's nothing similar for other planets or moons. If we discover evidence of past life on an alien world, most people would probably agree that we shouldn't claim ownership of it. But if we terraform a lifeless planet, who owns it? Would it belong to the country or company that did the terraforming, or would it belong to everyone? We haven't really thought about this issue yet because we haven't had to, but we're going to need some clear guidelines before we attempt to terraform anywhere else. Otherwise, it could lead to conflict between nations. Finally, there are philosophical questions about what's the right thing to do. Should we try to terraform a lifeless planet? Several ethical theories suggest that we shouldn't interfere with alien worlds. One theory is anthropocentrism, which says that only humans have intrinsic value, and that anything that is unhuman is only valuable to the extent that it is useful to us. Proponents of this view would say that if a planet isn't inhabited by intelligent life, it's not worthy of our concern. Another theory is biocentrism, which says that all life is equally valuable regardless of where it exists. So it would forbid us from terraforming an alien world if there are even the slight chance that it could harm native life, even microbial life. Ecocentrism takes this a step further and says that entire ecosystems are valuable in their own right, and it doesn't just protect actual living things, but also the habitats that could potentially support life. Some people take this view to say that we shouldn't disturb any planets at all, even if we know that they're uninhabited. They say we do want to have the right to decide whether some future species should have a habitat or not. Another reason not to terraform is the danger of contamination. If we send people or probes to an alien planet, there's always a risk that we'll contaminate it with Earth microbes. For example, we found bacteria in soil samples that were collected from the moon. There's also the worry that we could introduce invasive species to new worlds. For example, if we terraform Mars and then bring mammals there, they could easily outcompete native species for food and water. But perhaps the biggest problem with terraforming is the colonizer mindset. As we've seen on Earth, having a sense of ownership over a place can lead to exploitation. There's always the risk that we'll treat a planet badly if we think we own it. Overall, there are good reasons, both for and against terraforming. But ultimately, I think the decision comes down to how we view the universe. Are we alone in the universe? If so, then terraforming planets like Mars or Venus would be an interesting experiment. It would help us understand what went wrong in the evolution of these planets and teach us how to preserve Earth's atmosphere for billions of years to come. But if there are other forms of life out there, then we should be careful about terraforming because we don't know what kind of effects it could have. Instead, we should focus on preserving planets that could potentially support life, including here on Earth. If you enjoyed this video, you might like my video on whether we should search for extraterrestrial life. In that video, I explore the argument that discovering aliens would undermine human exceptionalism and the implications of that. Thanks for watching.